On the night of September 17, 1991, 12 armed men disappeared into the fog-shrouded hollows of Morgan's Creek, West Virginia, and by dawn on September 18, 9 people lay dead across 8 square miles of Appalachian wilderness. All adults, all eliminated with hunting rifles and military surplus weapons during what federal investigators would later call the most systematic rural standoff in West Virginia history. The perpetrators, the Cassidy clan, 3 generations of mountain families who'd turned their ancestral land into a fortress against federal authority. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't drugs, wasn't organized crime, wasn't even a generations-old feud. It was a single piece of paper, a federal court order demanding the seizure of 400 acres of land that had belonged to the same family since 1847. And one man's absolute conviction that some things were worth dying for rather than surrendering to government bureaucrats who'd never set foot in these mountains. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that shattered a small community and left scars that remain visible today. Morgan's Creek carved its way through the heart of Boone County, West Virginia, in 1991, a serpentine waterway that had flowed unchanged for thousands of years through some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States. The hollow stretched 12 miles from its mouth near the town of Madison to its headwaters high in the Coal River Mountains, where ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that midday looked like twilight even in September. Population in the entire hollow barely reached 300 souls scattered across family compounds, single-wide trailers, and weathered farmhouses that seemed to grow from the mountainsides like natural formations. September in these mountains meant temperatures dropping to the mid-40s at night, climbing to maybe 65 degrees by afternoon if the sun managed to penetrate the perpetual mist that clung to the ridgelines. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from coal stoves, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, and the metallic tang of mountain springs that bubbled up from limestone caverns deep underground. At night, when fog rolled down from the peaks like ghostly fingers, you could hear the cry of screech owls echoing off canyon walls, the distant howl of coyotes, and the constant whisper of Morgan's Creek itself, running cold and clear over rocks worn smooth by centuries of current. But 1991 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained these mountains for over a century was in complete collapse. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete barriers, their equipment rusting in autumn rain. Environmental regulations from Washington had shut down operations faster than companies could adapt. The Clean Air Act amendments had made West Virginia coal too expensive to burn. Unemployment in Boone County hovered around 60%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking cave-ins and explosions for union wages, now had nothing except disability checks that barely covered groceries and the crushing knowledge that their way of life was ending. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to the oldest Appalachian tradition outside of mining. They went back to the land, back to subsistence farming, hunting, and the fierce independence that had sustained mountain people since before the coal companies arrived. Others packed up and left for cities where jobs still existed. But a few, like the Cassidys, dug in deeper, convinced that the federal government that had destroyed their livelihoods was now coming for everything else they owned. Thomas Patrick Cassidy was 67 years old that September, though he moved like a man 20 years younger. 6 feet tall, lean as a fence post, with shoulders broadened by 5 decades of physical labor and hands scarred from everything the mountains could throw at a man. His hair had gone completely white, but his eyes remained the pale blue of winter sky, sharp enough to spot a deer at 200 yards, or read the weather in cloud formations most people never noticed. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and when he spoke, which wasn't often, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd never backed down from anything in his life. Every morning, Thomas woke at 5:30 in the 2-story log house his great-grandfather had built in 1847, the same year West Virginia coal was first shipped east on the new railroad. He'd make coffee in a percolator older than most people in the hollow, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, and sit on his front porch watching the sun struggle through morning mist. He'd smoke one cigarette, unfiltered Lucky Strike, and listen to the sounds of his land waking up. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the pasture, his grandson's dogs barking at some real or imagined threat. These were the sounds of continuity, of a way of life that connected him to every Cassidy who'd walked this land for 6 generations. Thomas had never left Morgan's Creek for longer than a week at a time. He'd been born in the same bedroom where his father died, had married his wife Sarah in the little Baptist church his grandfather helped build, and raised 4 sons who'd learned to hunt, fish, and work the land before they could properly tie their shoes. He valued tradition, self-reliance, and the absolute conviction that a man's property was sacred, that government had no business telling him what he could do on land his family had bled for and buried their dead in for nearly 150 years. The trouble started with something called the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. Federal legislation passed in 1977, but not fully enforced until the environmental movement gained political power in the late 1980s. The law required extensive environmental impact studies before any mining operation could begin, even on private land. It gave federal agencies the power to designate certain areas as environmentally sensitive, essentially placing them off-limits to development of any kind. And it allowed the government to seize private property if mining activities were deemed harmful to watersheds, wildlife habitats, or archaeological sites. Thomas had watched neighboring families lose their land to federal seizure over the past 5 years. The government would arrive with court orders, environmental surveys, and federal marshals. They'd declare the land protected habitat for some endangered salamander or critical watershed for some distant city's water supply. Property that had been in families for generations would be condemned, purchased for far below market value, and turned into federal wilderness areas where the original owners were forbidden to hunt, fish, or even walk without permits. The Cassidy land sat directly above an underground stream that fed into the Coal River watershed. In 1989, environmental groups had filed lawsuits claiming that any disturbance to the 400 acres of forest on Thomas's property could contaminate drinking water for thousands of people downstream. They wanted the land designated as a federal conservation area, which would require Thomas to sell to the government at whatever price bureaucrats deemed fair. Thomas had fought the lawsuits for 2 years, spending his life savings on lawyers who specialized in property rights cases. He'd attended hearings in Charleston and Washington, sitting in sterile conference rooms while environmental scientists and government attorneys discussed his land like he wasn't there, like 6 generations of Cassidy history meant nothing compared to their computer models and watershed studies. The lawyers had warned him that his chances were poor, that environmental law favored federal seizure over property rights, that he should take whatever settlement the government offered and find somewhere else to live. On September 12, 1991, the federal court in Charleston issued its final ruling. The Cassidy property would be seized under eminent domain. Thomas had 30 days to vacate the premises and accept the government's compensation offer of $180,000 for land that had been appraised privately at over $800,000. After legal fees, court costs, and taxes, he'd be left with maybe $60,000 to start over somewhere else at age 67. Thomas read the court order 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table while Sarah cried quietly in the chair beside him. Outside, their grandson Danny was feeding chickens, completely unaware that his inheritance had just been stolen by people who'd never seen Morgan's Creek, never breathed its air, never understood what this land meant to the people who'd shaped it with their hands and blood and sweat for 6 generations. That evening, Thomas walked the boundaries of his property, following fence lines his grandfather had built, checking markers carved into oak trees that had been saplings when his great-grandfather first claimed this hollow. He stood beside the family cemetery where 23 Cassidys rested under weathered headstones, including his parents, 2 infant sons who'd died in the 1950s, and Sarah's mother who'd lived with them for 15 years before cancer took her. This wasn't just land to Thomas Cassidy. This was sacred ground, bought with blood and consecrated with generations of love, loss, and backbreaking work. He thought about his great-grandfather Patrick, who'd walked into this hollow in 1847 with nothing but an axe, a rifle, and the determination to carve a homestead from wilderness. Patrick had cleared the forest by hand, built the first cabin with logs he cut himself, survived winters that killed weaker men, and fought off claim jumpers who thought they could steal what he'd built. Thomas thought about his grandfather Michael, who'd expanded the farm, built the current house, and raised 8 children during the Depression when families survived on what they could grow, hunt, and preserve. He thought about his father William, who'd worked the coal mines during the week and farmed on weekends, who'd taught Thomas that a man's worth was measured by his willingness to work and fight for what belonged to him. Now federal bureaucrats wanted to erase all of that with a court order and a check. They wanted to turn the Cassidy homestead into a nature preserve where government employees would give tours to environmental groups, explaining how they'd saved the watershed from the ignorant mountain families who'd lived here for generations without understanding the ecological significance of their land. Thomas made his decision standing beside his great-grandfather's grave as darkness fell over Morgan's Creek. Some things were worth more than money. Some things were worth more than life itself. Honor, tradition, the absolute conviction that a man's property was his castle and no government had the right to steal what generations had built. He'd given his word to his dying father that the land would stay in the family. He'd promised his sons that their children would inherit what their ancestors had bled for. Those promises meant more than federal court orders. If the government wanted his land, they'd have to take it by force, and if they came with force, he'd meet them with the same determination his great-grandfather had shown when claim jumpers threatened the homestead in 1852, the same resolve his grandfather had displayed when coal company thugs tried to force him to sell during the labor wars of the 1920s, the same courage his father had demonstrated when he'd stood up to strip mining companies that wanted to destroy the mountain for short-term profit. Thomas Patrick Cassidy walked back to his house through September darkness, already planning the transformation of his family farm into something the federal government had never encountered before. A fortress, a final stand, a place where mountain justice would collide with federal authority and only one would survive the encounter. Thomas spent the next 3 days quietly assembling what he would need. Not weapons, not yet, but information. He drove his battered 1987 Ford pickup to Charleston, parked outside the federal courthouse, and watched. Studied the comings and goings of U.S. Marshals, noted their vehicles, their routines, their numbers. Federal agents moved with the confidence of people who'd never faced serious resistance, who expected compliance from citizens too intimidated or too poor to fight back. They carried their authority like a shield, believing that badges and court orders were sufficient to overcome any opposition. Thomas had learned patience in Vietnam, where rushing got you killed and observation kept you alive. He'd spent 13 months in the jungle, watching enemy movement, learning to read terrain, understanding that knowledge was often more valuable than firepower. Now he applied those same skills to studying his enemy, because that's what the federal government had become the moment they decided to steal his land. He visited the county courthouse, pulled property records, studied survey maps, researched every legal precedent he could find. The pattern was always the same. Environmental groups would file lawsuits claiming ecological damage. Federal agencies would conduct studies that somehow always supported seizure. Courts would rule in favor of government authority. Property owners would be forced to sell at below-market prices or face criminal prosecution for trespassing on their own land. The system was rigged, designed to transfer private property to federal control under the guise of environmental protection. But Thomas also discovered something else in those records. Every previous seizure had been successful because property owners had fought in courtrooms instead of on their own land. They'd hired lawyers instead of preparing defenses. They'd trusted in legal processes designed to guarantee their defeat. Not one family had forced the government to take property by actual force, to risk federal agents' lives for a few hundred acres of mountain forest. That was their mistake, and it would not be his. On September 16th, Thomas called a family meeting. His 4 sons gathered in the living room where they'd spent countless evenings as children, listening to their grandfather tell stories about the old days, about surviving winters when the closest neighbor was 5 miles away, about fighting off wildcats and bears and men who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. James was 45, the oldest, a Vietnam veteran like his father who'd come home from Southeast Asia with skills the Army had spent considerable time teaching him. Robert was 42, built thick and strong from years working construction before the economy collapsed. Michael was 38, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who could fix anything mechanical and improvise solutions from whatever materials were available. Daniel was 34, the youngest, who'd inherited his father's gift for reading weather and terrain and his grandfather's absolute refusal to back down from any fight. Also present were Thomas's brother Frank, 61, who lived 2 miles down the hollow with his 3 sons. Frank had spent 30 years underground before black lung forced him to retire. and he'd watched the coal companies destroy the mountains he'd worked his entire life to protect. The Cassidy cousins, Frank's boys, were all in their 30s, all unemployed since the mines closed, all carrying the same stubborn pride that had sustained the family for 6 generations. Thomas spread the federal court order across the kitchen table, the same table where the family had eaten thousands of meals, where they'd planned spring planting and fall harvesting, where they'd discussed everything that mattered in their lives. The paper looked small and insignificant among the familiar surroundings, but its implications were enormous. "Government says we got 30 days to get off our land," Thomas said, his voice steady and calm. "Says they're taking it for the greater good, for environmental protection, for the watershed." He looked at each of his sons, each of his nephews. "I want to know where you boys stand." James spoke first. "This is our home, Dad. Been our home since before West Virginia was even a state. They got no right." "Courts say they do," Thomas replied. "Environmental Protection Agency says the stream that runs through our land feeds into Coal River. Says any disturbance to our forest could contaminate drinking water for people in Charleston. Says our land's too important to leave in private hands." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Dad, I've been thinking about this since you first got that lawsuit. These environmental groups, they're funded by people who live in cities, who've never been to West Virginia except maybe to take pictures of pretty mountains. They want to turn our home into a park where they can come hiking on weekends and feel good about saving nature." Michael nodded. "And the government agents who'll enforce this, they're the same people who've been destroying coal country for the past 10 years. They don't care about us, don't care about our families, don't care about what this land means to people who've worked it for generations." Daniel, the youngest, had been quiet through the discussion. Finally, he spoke. "Question is, what are we going to do about it? We can fight it in court, but Dad's already spent everything we had on lawyers. We can take their money and leave, find somewhere else to live, or—" he let the sentence hang in the air. "Or we make them take it by force," Frank finished. "Make them send federal agents up this hollow with guns and warrants. Make them prove they're willing to kill American citizens for a few hundred acres of trees." Thomas had expected this moment, had known it would come to this choice. "Boys, I need you to understand what we're talking about here. If we resist, if we make our stand on this land, there's no going back. Federal government doesn't negotiate with people who defy their authority. They'll come with overwhelming force, and some of us probably won't survive what comes next." Sarah appeared in the doorway, having listened to the entire conversation from the kitchen. She was 64, had been married to Thomas for 44 years, had raised 4 sons, and buried 2 infant daughters in the family cemetery. Her face was lined with age and worry, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Thomas Cassidy, I've stood by you through everything, through Vietnam, through the mine closures, through watching our neighbors lose their land one by one. But I need to know this isn't about your pride. This isn't about proving you're tougher than the federal government." Thomas looked at his wife, the woman who'd shared his life, his bed, his dreams for nearly half a century. "Sarah, this is about keeping a promise I made to my dying father. This is about making sure our grandchildren inherit what their ancestors built. This is about proving that some things matter more than government authority. And if you die for this land, if our sons die for this land, what good does that do our grandchildren?" The room fell silent. Outside, evening fog was beginning to form in the hollow, the familiar mist that had rolled down from the mountains every September evening for thousands of years. Through the window, Thomas could see the family cemetery, the weathered headstones of 6 generations of Cassidys who'd lived and died on this land. "Sarah," Thomas said finally, "I'd rather our boys die fighting for what's theirs than live knowing they gave it away without a fight. Some things are worth dying for. This land, this family, the principle that a man's property is sacred, that's worth dying for." One by one, his sons nodded. Frank and his 3 boys nodded. They'd made their choice, accepting the consequences, understanding that in 14 days, when federal agents arrived to enforce the court order, Morgan's Creek would become a battlefield. But first, they had work to do. Over the next week, the Cassidy compound underwent a quiet transformation. To outside observers, nothing appeared different. The family went about their normal routines, tending livestock, maintaining equipment, preparing for winter, as they had every September for generations. But underneath the surface, they were turning their ancestral home into something federal agents had never encountered in domestic law enforcement. James and Robert used their construction experience to reinforce the main house, adding steel plates behind wooden walls, creating firing positions that looked like normal windows, establishing supply caches in the basement and outbuildings. Michael worked on communications, setting up CB radios and emergency frequencies that would allow coordination between different positions on the property. Daniel mapped every trail, every creek bed, every cave and rock formation that could provide cover or concealment. They cleaned weapons that hadn't been fired in years, hunting rifles and military surplus firearms accumulated over decades of mountain living. They stockpiled ammunition, medical supplies, and enough food to last for weeks if necessary. They studied topographic maps, planned fields of fire, established rally points and escape routes through terrain they'd known since childhood. Most importantly, they reached out to neighbors, to other families facing similar federal pressure, to men who understood that the seizure of Cassidy land was just the beginning of a larger campaign to empty the mountains of people who'd lived there for generations. Word spread through the hollow, quiet conversations on front porches and in church parking lots, the kind of communication network that had sustained mountain communities since before telephones existed. By September 24th, the day before federal agents were scheduled to arrive with eviction notices, the Cassidy compound had become something unprecedented in modern American law enforcement. Not just a fortified position, but the center of a resistance network that extended throughout Morgan's Creek and into neighboring hollows. Men who'd lost their jobs when the mines closed, who'd watched their communities die, who'd seen their neighbors forced off their land, had finally found something worth fighting for. Thomas stood on his front porch that final evening, watching fog roll down from the mountains like it had every September evening of his life. Tomorrow, federal agents would drive up the dirt road that led to his house, expecting to serve papers on a defeated old man who'd accepted the inevitable. Instead, they'd encounter something that would transform a routine property seizure into the worst domestic standoff in West Virginia history. The mountain was ready, the family was ready, and in 12 hours, when the first government vehicle appeared at the mouth of Morgan's Creek, 6 generations of Cassidy pride and mountain justice would collide with federal authority in a confrontation that would leave 9 people dead and change how the government approached property seizures in rural America forever. At 6:47 a.m. on September 25, 1991, U.S., Marshal David Henderson pulled his government sedan onto the narrow dirt road that wound through Morgan's Creek toward the Cassidy homestead. Henderson was 34 years old, 8 years with the Marshal Service, had served hundreds of eviction notices and property seizures across West Virginia without incident. This was supposed to be routine paperwork, a court-ordered notification that would give the Cassidy family their final 48-hour warning before federal agents returned to physically remove them from the premises. Henderson had grown up in Charleston, understood mountain culture enough to know that most families eventually accepted the inevitable when faced with federal authority. Sure, there might be some angry words, maybe threats about constitutional rights and property seizure, but in the end, people signed the papers and moved on. The government had legal authority, unlimited resources, and the power to make life extremely difficult for anyone who chose resistance over compliance. What Henderson didn't know as he navigated the winding mountain road was that Thomas Cassidy had spent the past 9 days transforming his property into something federal agents had never encountered in domestic law enforcement. Every turn in the road had been scouted, every approach route mapped and prepared. Hidden observers had been watching the mouth of Morgan's Creek since before dawn, tracking Henderson's progress through a network of CB radio communications that connected positions throughout the hollow. At 7:15 a.m., Henderson's sedan rounded the final curve and entered the clearing where the Cassidy house sat. What he saw looked normal enough. 2-story log structure, weathered but well-maintained, surrounded by outbuildings and livestock pens. Smoke rising from the chimney, a few chickens pecking in the yard. Thomas Cassidy sitting on his front porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the government car approach with the calm expression of a man who'd been expecting this visit for days. Henderson parked near the front porch, checked his paperwork one final time, and stepped out of the vehicle. The morning air was crisp, maybe 45 degrees, with the kind of mountain silence that city dwellers never experienced. No traffic noise, no urban sounds, just the whisper of wind through trees, and the distant trickle of Morgan's Creek running over limestone rocks, worn smooth by centuries of current. "Mr. Thomas Cassidy?" Henderson called out, walking toward the porch with official documents in hand. "That's me," Thomas replied, not standing, not moving from his rocking chair. "I'm U.S. Marshal David Henderson. I have a court-ordered notice requiring you to vacate these premises within 48 hours. After that deadline, federal agents will return to physically remove any persons or property remaining on the land." Thomas set his coffee cup down carefully on the porch railing. "Marshal, I appreciate you doing your job, but I need you to understand something. This land has belonged to my family for 144 years. 6 generations of Cassidys are buried in that cemetery over there. My great-grandfather cleared this forest with his own hands, built the first cabin, raised his children here. My grandfather expanded the farm during the Depression when families lived or died based on what they could grow themselves. My father worked the coal mines to keep this place running, and I've spent my entire life maintaining what they built." Henderson had heard similar speeches before. "Sir, I understand your emotional attachment to this property, but the federal court has ruled that environmental protection takes precedence over private ownership in this case. The compensation you're being offered is fair market value as determined by government appraisers." "Fair market value," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying a note of something Henderson couldn't quite identify. "Marshal, you know what the government's offering me for 400 acres of prime mountain land. $180,000. Know what I paid in legal fees trying to fight this seizure? $120,000. After taxes and court costs, I'll be left with maybe $60,000 to start over somewhere else at age 67. Sir, I don't make policy decisions. I just enforce court orders." Thomas stood slowly, his full height making him an imposing figure even at 67. "Marshal Henderson, I want you to take a message back to whoever sent you. Tell them Thomas Cassidy said they can take their court order and their compensation check and go straight to hell. This land stays in my family." Henderson felt the first stirring of concern. In 8 years of serving eviction notices, he'd never encountered absolute defiance delivered with such quiet certainty. Most people got angry, shouted, made threats they didn't mean. Thomas Cassidy spoke like a man who'd already made peace with whatever consequences his words might bring. "Mr. Cassidy, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Federal law enforcement has unlimited resources. Resistance will only make things worse for you and your family. Marshal, you seem like a decent man, so I'm going to give you some advice. When you drive back down that mountain, you tell your supervisors that they better bring everything they've got if they want this land. Because I'm not leaving, my sons aren't leaving, and my neighbors have had enough of watching the government steal property from mountain families." Henderson looked around the clearing with new awareness. The silence that had seemed peaceful now felt ominous. Windows in the main house that had appeared normal now looked like observation points, outbuildings positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The tree line that surrounded the property offered countless positions for concealment. "Sir, are you threatening federal agents?" "I'm stating a fact. You want this land, you'll have to take it by force. And Marshal Henderson, I served in Vietnam. My son served in the military. My neighbors have been fighting these mountains their whole lives. We're not city people who'll roll over because someone shows us a badge and a court order." Henderson backed toward his vehicle, suddenly aware that this routine notification had become something else entirely. "Mr. Cassidy, I'll relay your message to my supervisors, but I want you to understand that resistance to federal authority is a serious crime. You could face decades in federal prison." Thomas smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Marshal, at my age, life in prison and death look pretty similar. But this land, this family legacy, that's worth more than an old man's remaining years." Henderson climbed into his sedan, started the engine, and began the long drive back to Charleston. In his rearview mirror, he could see Thomas Cassidy still standing on the porch, watching the government vehicle disappear around the bend. What Henderson couldn't see were the dozen other men positioned throughout the forest, men who'd observed the entire conversation through rifle scopes and binoculars, men who now knew exactly how much time they had before federal agents returned in force. By 11:30 a.m., Henderson was sitting in the federal building in Charleston, briefing his supervisor, Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Cross, on what had transpired at the Cassidy property. Cross was 52 years old, 26 years with the Marshal Service, had overseen hundreds of property seizures throughout Appalachia. He'd dealt with angry mountain families before, had seen the tough talk that usually evaporated when confronted with overwhelming federal authority. So he refused to accept the eviction notice? Cross asked, reviewing Henderson's report. More than refused. He essentially declared war on the federal government, talked about his sons, his neighbors, mentioned Vietnam service and military training. Chief, this felt different from the usual mountain bluster. Cross leaned back in his chair, considering options. Standard procedure called for returning with additional agents, federal marshals backed by local law enforcement, enough manpower to ensure compliance with the court order. Most mountain families backed down when faced with a show of force, but something in Henderson's report suggested the Cassidys might not follow the usual pattern. How many people are we talking about? Hard to say. Thomas Cassidy, his 4 sons, probably some extended family. But he mentioned neighbors, talked about other mountain families. Could be a dozen men, could be more. Weapons? Didn't see any displayed, but this is rural West Virginia. Assume everyone's armed with hunting rifles at minimum. Cross made his decision. We'll return Thursday morning with 6 agents. Coordinate with Boone County Sheriff's Office for backup. Standard overwhelming force doctrine. When they see 12 armed federal agents, they'll realize resistance is futile. What Cross didn't understand was that Thomas Cassidy had been counting on exactly that response. The old man had studied federal law enforcement tactics, had researched every similar confrontation over property seizures. Government agents always responded to defiance with overwhelming force, believing that superior numbers and firepower would intimidate resistance into surrender. They'd arrive with multiple vehicles, body armor, automatic weapons, and absolute confidence in their authority. But they'd be entering terrain the Cassidys had known for 6 generations, approaching positions that had been prepared for 9 days, facing men who'd decided that death was preferable to surrender. Federal agents trained for urban operations, hostage rescues, drug raids in controlled environments. They'd never faced entrenched resistance on ground chosen and prepared by their opponents. Thomas spent Tuesday evening walking his property boundaries one final time, following fence lines his grandfather had built, checking defensive positions his sons had prepared, visiting the family cemetery where 23 Cassidys rested under weathered headstones. This wasn't just land to him. This was sacred ground, consecrated by generations of blood, sweat, and tears. If government agents wanted to desecrate that sacred space, they'd pay a price higher than any court order was worth. Wednesday morning brought news that changed everything. Frank Cassidy's middle son, Marcus, worked part-time as a janitor in the federal building in Charleston. He'd overheard conversations between marshals, knew the government's plans, understood the timeline for the assault on his family's property. Thursday morning, September 26th, 12 federal agents would drive up Morgan's Creek expecting to overwhelm an old man and his sons with superior firepower and legal authority. Instead, they'd encounter something unprecedented in modern American law enforcement. A prepared battlefield where mountain men who'd spent their lives hunting, fighting, and surviving in some of the most challenging terrain in the country would make their final stand against federal tyranny. Thomas gathered his family that evening for what he knew might be their last meal together as free men. "Boys," he said, looking at his sons, his brother, his nephews. "Tomorrow they come for our land. Tomorrow we show them what happens when government bureaucrats try to steal from mountain families. Tomorrow we prove that some things are still worth fighting for in this country." Outside, fog was rolling down from the ridgelines like it had every September evening for thousands of years. The mountains were preparing for battle, and morning would bring either victory or death for the last free family in Morgan's Creek. But whatever happened, Thomas Cassidy would meet it standing on his own land, surrounded by his own blood, defending what 6 generations had built with their hands and hearts and unbreakable mountain pride. The siege of Morgan's Creek would begin in 12 hours, and nothing would ever be the same. At 5:30 a.m. on September 26, 1991, Thomas Cassidy stood in the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen, making what he knew might be his final cup of coffee in the house where he'd been born. The percolator bubbled and hissed, the familiar sound that had marked the beginning of every day for 67 years. Through the window, he could see fog still clinging to the hollow like a shroud, but the eastern sky was beginning to show the faintest hint of gray. Dawn was coming, and with it, the federal agents who'd decided his family's legacy was worth less than environmental regulations, written by people who'd never breathed mountain air. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, still in her nightgown, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. She hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. How could a woman sleep knowing her husband and sons were about to face federal agents in what amounted to a small war? She'd spent the night praying, not for victory, but for wisdom, for some last-minute miracle that might prevent the bloodshed everyone knew was coming. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the percolator's bubbling. "It's not too late. We could still leave. Take their money. Find somewhere else to live. You and we've had 44 good years. That's more than most people get." Thomas poured coffee into the same chipped mug he'd used every morning since returning from Vietnam. The ceramic was stained dark from decades of mountain coffee, strong enough to strip paint. He sat across from his wife, studying her face in the dim light from the overhead bulb. Sarah had aged gracefully, but worry had carved new lines around her eyes over the past weeks, and her hands shook slightly as she held her cup. "Sarah, you remember what my father told me when he was dying? What he made me promise?" She nodded, tears already forming. "That the land would stay in the family, that you'd never let outsiders take what the Cassidys had built. I gave my word to a dying man. My father, your father-in-law, the man who worked himself to death in the coal mines to keep this place running. You want me to break that promise now? I want my husband alive. I want my sons alive. I want grandchildren who know their grandfather, not just stories about the crazy old man who died fighting the government." Thomas reached across the table, took her hands in his. His fingers were rough from a lifetime of manual labor, scarred from countless injuries that came with mountain living. "Sarah, what kind of grandfather would I be if I taught those grandchildren that a man gives up what's his when government thugs come calling? What kind of legacy is surrender?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard the first vehicle approaching, the sound of an engine straining up the mountain road, still distant but getting closer. Thomas stood, walked to the window, peered through curtains into the gray dawn. Nothing visible yet, but the sound was unmistakable. Government vehicles, multiple engines, the convoy that would change everything. "They're coming," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what those words meant. In the barn, James Cassidy was making final adjustments to the scope on his hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in 30-006 that had belonged to his grandfather. The weapon was old but well maintained, capable of accurate fire out to 300 yards in the right hands. James had the right hands. 2 tours in Vietnam had taught him patience, precision, and the cold calculation necessary to end human lives from distance. He'd hoped never to use those skills again, but federal agents had made that choice for him. Robert and Michael were positioned in the old tobacco barn, a weathered structure that provided excellent fields of fire toward the main road. They'd spent 3 days reinforcing the building, adding steel plates behind wooden walls, creating firing positions that looked like normal gaps in the barn siding. Their weapons were modern, semi-automatic rifles purchased legally at gun shows, capable of rapid fire when federal agents realized they'd walked into a prepared battlefield. Daniel had taken the most dangerous position, hidden in the tree line 200 yards from the house, armed with a scoped hunting rifle and enough ammunition to pin down government vehicles if they tried to retreat. At 34, he was the youngest of Thomas's sons, but he'd inherited his father's gift for reading terrain and his great-grandfather's absolute refusal to surrender what belonged to him. Frank Cassidy and his 3 sons held positions throughout the property, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the peaceful family compound into a killing zone if federal agents chose violence over negotiation. They'd spent 9 days preparing for this moment, studying maps, planning contingencies, accepting the reality that most of them probably wouldn't survive what was coming. But survival wasn't the point anymore. The point was proving that some Americans still believed in principles worth dying for, that property rights meant something beyond government convenience, that mountain families wouldn't be pushed around by federal bureaucrats who saw Appalachian land as empty space waiting for environmental protection. At 6:23 a.m., the first government vehicle appeared at the mouth of the clearing, a black SUV with federal plates, followed by another, then another. 6 vehicles total, windows tinted, antennas bristling from roofs, the unmistakable appearance of federal law enforcement arriving with overwhelming force. The convoy stopped just inside the tree line, engines idling, occupants studying the compound through binoculars and rifle scopes. Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Cross sat in the lead vehicle, studying the Cassidy property through military-grade binoculars. The compound looked peaceful enough, smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, a few chickens pecking in the yard. Thomas Cassidy visible on the front porch, rocking chair moving slowly back and forth, coffee cup in hand. The scene could have been painted by Norman Rockwell if you ignored the tension crackling through the mountain air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Positions?" Cross asked through his radio. "Alpha team ready," came the response from the second vehicle. "Bravo team in position. Charlie team covering the rear approach. 12 federal agents armed with automatic weapons, body armor, and the absolute confidence that came from never facing serious resistance during domestic operations. They'd dealt with angry mountain families before, had seen the tough talk that usually evaporated when confronted with federal authority. This would be no different. Show overwhelming force, demonstrate government power, watch the Cassidys realize that resistance was futile. All teams, this is Cross. Standard procedure. We approach the house, serve the final eviction notice, give them 30 minutes to gather personal belongings. Anyone who resists gets arrested for interfering with federal agents. Questions? No questions. The operation was routine, by the book, exactly what federal agents had done hundreds of times throughout Appalachia when environmental regulations required property seizures. The only difference was the number of agents involved, insurance against the kind of mountain bluster Marshal Henderson had reported. What Cross didn't know was that every word of his radio transmission was being monitored by CB radio operators throughout Morgan's Creek. The Cassidys had established a communication network that extended far beyond their property, connecting sympathetic families throughout the hollow who'd watched their neighbors lose land to federal seizure over the past 5 years. Word was already spreading through the mountains that the final confrontation had begun. At 6:31 a.m., Cross gave the order to advance. 6 black SUVs rolled slowly across the clearing, maintaining formation, stopping 50 yards from the main house. 12 federal agents climbed out simultaneously, weapons visible but not raised, body armor making them look like military soldiers rather than civilian law enforcement. They moved with practiced precision, establishing a perimeter around the house, cutting off potential escape routes. Thomas Cassidy remained in his rocking chair, watching the federal deployment with the calm interest of a man studying weather patterns. He'd expected this show of force, had counted on government agents responding to defiance with overwhelming numbers. Federal law enforcement operated on intimidation, the belief that superior firepower and legal authority would overcome any resistance. They'd never faced mountain men who decided that death was preferable to surrender. "Thomas Cassidy," Cross called out, standing behind the open door of his vehicle. "I'm Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Cross. I have a federal court order requiring you to vacate these premises immediately. You have 30 minutes to gather personal belongings before we take physical control of this property." Thomas set his coffee cup on the porch railing, stood slowly, walked to the edge of the porch steps. At 67, he still moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life navigating difficult terrain. His white hair caught the morning light, and his pale blue eyes studied the federal agents with the kind of attention most people reserved for dangerous animals. "Marshal Cross," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I told your man Henderson what I thought of your court order. My position hasn't changed. This land belongs to my family, has belonged to my family since before West Virginia was a state. You want it? You'll have to kill me for it." Cross felt the first stirring of real concern. The old man's voice carried absolute conviction, the tone of someone who'd already accepted whatever consequences his words might bring. This wasn't mountain bluster or empty threats. This was a man who'd made peace with dying for his principles. "Mr. Cassidy, resistance to federal authority is a serious crime. I'm ordering you to comply with this court order or face immediate arrest." Thomas smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "Marshal, you see that cemetery over there? 23 Cassidys buried in that ground, including my parents, my infant children, my wife's mother. You think I'm afraid of joining them? Sir, we don't want violence, but we're prepared for it. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the full authority of the United States government. Surrender now, and no one gets hurt." Thomas looked at the federal agents, counted weapons, studied positions. 12 men with automatic rifles and body armor, confident in their superior firepower, certain that overwhelming force would guarantee compliance. They'd positioned themselves in the open, using their vehicles as cover, following standard federal law enforcement doctrine for domestic operations. Marshal Cross, I want you to understand something. You're not dealing with some drug dealer or bank robber who'll surrender when you show him a badge. You're dealing with American citizens who've decided that property rights matter more than government convenience. Mountain men who've spent their lives fighting everything these hills could throw at them. Veterans who've faced worse than federal agents in jungles on the other side of the world. Cross raised his weapon, a Colt M4 carbine, pointing it directly at Thomas. Last warning, Mr. Cassidy. Surrender now or face the consequences. Thomas Cassidy looked down the barrel of the federal agent's rifle, seeing his own death reflected in the black muzzle. He thought about his great-grandfather Patrick, who'd cleared this land with an axe and determination. About his grandfather Michael, who'd built the house during the Depression when families lived or died based on what they could grow themselves. About his father William, who'd worked the coal mines to keep the family farm running. About the promise he'd made to his dying father that the land would stay in the family forever. Marshal Cross, Thomas said quietly, go to hell. Cross squeezed the trigger. The M4 carbine barked once, a sharp crack that echoed off the mountainsides like thunder. Thomas Cassidy spun sideways, struck in the chest by a 5.56 millimeter round that punched through his flannel shirt and into his heart. He fell backward onto the porch, blood spreading across weathered wooden planks his grandfather had laid with his own hands. For a moment, silence returned to Morgan's Creek. Federal agents stood frozen, shocked by the sudden transition from negotiation to violence. They'd expected surrender, had counted on the old man backing down when faced with imminent death. Instead, they'd just executed an American citizen on his own property for the crime of refusing to abandon his family's legacy. Then the mountains exploded. James Cassidy's Winchester spoke first, the .30-06 round taking the federal agent closest to his father's body. The man dropped without a sound, his automatic rifle clattering across gravel. Robert and Michael opened fire from the tobacco barn, their semi-automatic rifles stitching rounds across the federal perimeter. Daniel's scoped hunting rifle barked from the tree line, and another federal agent fell, his body armor useless against precision fire from a skilled marksman. Federal agents dove for cover, scrambling behind vehicles, returning fire toward muzzle flashes in the barn and forest. Automatic weapons chattered, brass casings raining on gravel. The peaceful mountain morning transformed into a battlefield where American citizens fought their own government with the desperate fury of men who'd lost everything except their willingness to die for principle. Chief Deputy Marshal Cross found himself pinned behind his SUV, rounds punching through metal and glass, realizing with growing horror that his overwhelming force doctrine had just encountered something unprecedented in modern federal law enforcement. Not criminals or terrorists, but American families who'd decided that some things were worth more than life itself. Property rights, generational legacy, the absolute conviction that government authority ended where family honor began. The siege of Morgan's Creek had begun, and before it ended, 9 people would be dead, and the federal government would learn that there were still Americans willing to fight and die, rather than surrender what their ancestors had built with blood and determination in the unforgiving mountains of West Virginia. The gunfight lasted 17 minutes and changed everything about federal law enforcement in rural America forever. When the echoes of the last gunshot faded across Morgan's Creek, 3 federal agents lay dead in the gravel clearing, their blood mixing with mountain mist that had begun to lift as the September sun climbed higher. Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Cross crouched behind his bullet-riddled SUV, radio in hand, calling for backup that was 40 miles away and might as well have been on the moon. This is Cross. We have multiple agents down. Repeat, multiple federal agents down. We need immediate backup, medical evacuation, and tactical support. We're under heavy fire from entrenched positions. The response crackled through static. Copy that, Cross. FBI tactical team en route from Charleston. ETA 90 minutes. State police helicopter dispatching from Huntington. Can you maintain position? Cross looked at his remaining agents, 9 men pinned behind vehicles by rifle fire from positions they couldn't see, facing an enemy that knew every rock and tree on this mountainside. Blood ran from a graze across his forehead where a bullet had come close enough to part his hair. His tactical vest had stopped 2 rounds, leaving him bruised, but alive. 3 of his men weren't as fortunate. Negative, we cannot maintain offensive position, switching to defensive posture pending arrival of tactical support. What Cross didn't understand was that Thomas Cassidy's death had triggered something larger than a family defending their property. The gunshot that killed the old man had been heard throughout Morgan's Creek, carried by mountain acoustics that amplified sound across the hollow. Within minutes, CB radios throughout the area crackled with news that federal agents had murdered Thomas Cassidy in cold blood on his own front porch. 2 miles down the hollow, Billy Henderson was feeding cattle when his radio erupted with reports of the shooting. Billy was no relation to Marshall Henderson, just another mountain family that had watched their neighbors lose land to federal seizure over the past 5 years. He'd known Thomas Cassidy for 30 years, had helped him rebuild his barn after a storm in 1985, had bought moonshine from him during the hardest years when legitimate work was impossible to find. Billy dropped his feed bucket, ran to his house, grabbed his deer rifle and a box of ammunition. His wife tried to stop him, begged him not to get involved, reminded him they had 3 children who needed their father alive. But Billy had watched too many good families destroyed by government bureaucrats who treated mountain people like obstacles to environmental progress. They killed Thomas Cassidy, he told his wife, checking the action on his rifle. Shot him down like a dog on his own porch for refusing to give up his family's land. If they can do that to Thomas, they can do it to any of us. Billy wasn't the only one who made that decision. Throughout Morgan's Creek, men grabbed hunting rifles and headed toward the sound of gunfire. Unemployed coal miners who'd lost everything when the mines closed. Veterans who'd served in Vietnam and Korea and understood what Thomas Cassidy had tried to protect. Fathers who looked at their own children and realized that surrendering to federal authority meant condemning the next generation to lives as refugees in their own country. By 7:15 a.m., 8 additional men had reached positions overlooking the Cassidy compound. They moved through forest they'd hunted since childhood, using game trails and creek beds to approach without detection. Federal agents trained for urban operations had no idea they were being surrounded by a force that grew larger every minute as word spread through the mountain community. Frank Cassidy, Thomas's brother, had taken command of the family's resistance after watching his older brother die on the front porch. At 61, Frank moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent 30 years underground, reading coal seams and rock formations, understanding that one mistake could kill everyone around you. He'd positioned himself in the root cellar behind the main house, protected by 2 feet of earth and stone, armed with a Springfield rifle that had belonged to his father. "James," he called to his nephew through the gun battle, "you still with us?" "Still here, Uncle Frank. Got 2 of the bastards from the barn position." "Robert, Michael, sound off. We're good. Plenty of ammunition, good fields of fire. These government boys don't know how to fight in the mountains." Frank studied the federal positions through gaps in the stone foundation. 9 agents remaining, pinned behind vehicles, unable to advance or retreat. Their tactics were designed for urban environments where superior firepower and coordination could overwhelm resistance. Here, surrounded by terrain their opponents had known since birth, federal advantages meant nothing. "Daniel, you still mobile out there?" "Moving between positions. Got a clear shot on their radio man if you want me to take it." Frank considered. Killing the federal communications specialist would isolate the agents, cut them off from reinforcements and tactical support. But it would also escalate the confrontation beyond any possibility of negotiation. Once communication was severed, this became a fight to the death with no quarter asked or given. "Hold your fire on the radio operator. Let them call for help. Let the whole damn federal government know what happens when they murder American citizens on their own property." What Frank understood, what the federal agents didn't, was that time favored the mountain defenders. Every hour the siege continued brought more local support, more men with rifles who'd decided that Thomas Cassidy's death demanded an answer. Federal agents had ammunition for maybe 2 hours of sustained combat. The mountain men had supplies cached throughout the property, and the knowledge to hold these positions for weeks if necessary. Chief Deputy Marshal Cross crouched behind his SUV, watching his tactical situation deteriorate by the minute. His agents were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, facing an enemy that seemed to materialize from the forest itself. Every time one of his men tried to move, rifle fire erupted from a new position, forcing them back behind cover. "Sir," called Agent Martinez from behind the second vehicle, "we're taking fire from at least 8 different positions. These aren't random mountain men shooting from the hip. This is coordinated defense by people who know what they're doing." Cross had served in the First Gulf War, understood military tactics, recognized professional competence when he encountered it. The Cassidys and their supporters weren't random criminals or deranged cultists. They were American veterans using skills the military had taught them, defending ground they'd chosen and prepared, motivated by the kind of conviction that made ordinary men capable of extraordinary violence. "Agent Foster, status report. 3 agents KIA, 2 wounded but mobile, ammunition at 60%. Sir, we need immediate tactical support or we're going to lose this position." Cross checked his watch. 7:23 a.m., FBI tactical team wouldn't arrive for another hour. State police helicopter was en route but would be useless against entrenched positions protected by forest canopy. His remaining agents were professional law enforcement officers, but they'd never faced sustained combat against determined resistance in terrain that favored the defenders. "All agents maintain defensive positions. Do not attempt to advance. Conserve ammunition. Help is coming." But Cross knew that help might arrive too late. The federal government had stumbled into something unprecedented in modern American law enforcement. Not a criminal enterprise or terrorist cell, but American families defending their property with military precision and mountain fury. Men who'd decided that death was preferable to surrender, that some things mattered more than federal authority. At 7:45 a.m., the character of the battle changed again. Cross heard new gunfire from behind his position, different weapons, different directions. His radio crackled with panicked transmissions from agents covering the rear approach. "Contact rear, multiple shooters in the tree line. We're surrounded. Repeat, we are surrounded." Billy Henderson and 7 other mountain men had reached positions that overlooked the federal perimeter from the south. They moved with the patient skill of hunters who'd spent their lives tracking deer through difficult terrain, using every fold of ground and tree for concealment. Their weapons were hunting rifles, scoped and zeroed for mountain distances, in the hands of men who could drop a running deer at 200 yards. Cross realized with growing horror that his overwhelming force doctrine had just encountered its worst nightmare. Not only were his agents pinned down by the original defenders, they were now caught in a crossfire between multiple groups of armed mountain men who'd decided the federal government had gone too far. "All units, we have hostile contact from multiple directions. Repeat, we are surrounded by approximately 15 armed subjects. Request immediate tactical air support." The response was immediate but useless. Cross, air support is not authorized for domestic law enforcement operations without specific approval from Washington. Continue to hold position. Cross wanted to scream into the radio that Washington bureaucrats didn't understand what was happening in Morgan's Creek. This wasn't a routine property seizure anymore. This was armed rebellion by American citizens who'd reached their breaking point, who'd decided that federal authority ended where their property rights began. Frank Cassidy heard the federal radio transmissions through equipment his nephew Michael had rigged to monitor government frequencies. The agents were trapped, surrounded, calling for help that wouldn't arrive in time to save them. But Frank also understood that killing federal agents would bring consequences that would destroy every family in Morgan's Creek. The government would respond with overwhelming force, would turn the entire hollow into a battlefield until every man, woman, and child who'd participated in the resistance was dead or imprisoned. "All positions, this is Frank. Hold your fire unless they try to advance. Let them sit there and think about what they've done." James Cassidy's voice crackled through the CB radio. "Uncle Frank, they murdered Daddy in cold blood, shot him down on his own porch for refusing to abandon our family's land. I know, boy, I know. But if we kill all of them, the government will send an army up this hollow. They'll destroy every family for miles around. We've made our point. Now we need to find a way to end this before more people die." But Frank Cassidy was wrong about one thing. The killing wasn't over. At 8:17 a.m., Agent Martinez tried to move from his position behind the second SUV to reach the wounded Agent Foster. Mountain men held their fire, respecting Frank's order to avoid escalation. But Martinez, terrified and disoriented, mistook the movement of shadows for enemy positions. He opened fire with his automatic rifle, spraying rounds wildly into the forest. One of those rounds found Billy Henderson, who'd been lying motionless behind a fallen log 150 yards away. The bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly. Billy Henderson, father of 3, unemployed coal miner, man who'd come to the aid of neighbors under attack, died defending principles he'd inherited from generations of mountain families who'd never surrendered to outside authority. Billy's death triggered something that Frank Cassidy couldn't control. The mountain men who'd surrounded the federal position were no longer bound by orders for restraint. Their friend, their neighbor, had been murdered by federal agents who'd already killed Thomas Cassidy. The rules of engagement changed in that instant from defensive action to blood vengeance. Rifle fire erupted from 8 positions simultaneously. Agent Martinez died before he could take cover, his body torn apart by hunting bullets designed to drop large game. 2 more federal agents fell in the first volley, their tactical training useless against precision fire from men who'd learned to shoot before they could read. Chief Deputy Marshal Cross found himself commanding a losing battle against American citizens who decided that federal authority was worth less than family honor. His remaining 6 agents were pinned down, ammunition running low, facing an enemy that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. The peaceful property seizure had become the worst domestic law enforcement disaster in modern American history. And somewhere in the distance, growing louder by the minute, Cross could hear the sound of more vehicles approaching. Not federal reinforcements, but pickup trucks full of mountain men who'd heard the gunfire and decided that the time for surrender had passed forever. The siege of Morgan's Creek was about to become something unprecedented in American history. Not just a family defending their property, but an entire community's armed rebellion against a federal government that had forgotten the difference between legal authority and moral legitimacy. Before this day ended, the balance of power between Washington bureaucrats and mountain families would be written in blood on the slopes of West Virginia's most unforgiving terrain. The siege of Morgan's Creek ended at 11:47 a.m. on September 26, 1991, when FBI tactical teams finally arrived to find 6 dead federal agents and 3 dead mountain defenders scattered across a battlefield that had once been a peaceful family farm. Chief Deputy Marshal Cross survived, along with 2 of his agents, all 3 requiring medical evacuation for wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. But the real casualties couldn't be counted in bodies. Thomas Cassidy's death had shattered something fundamental in the relationship between rural Americans and their federal government. Word of the siege spread through Appalachian communities like wildfire, carried by CB radios, church networks, and the kind of mountain communication that had sustained resistance movements for generations. Within hours, the story had reached coal camps and farming valleys throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. By evening, it had gone national. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, over 200 federal agents had occupied Morgan's Creek, turning the hollow into an armed camp. Every family within 10 miles was questioned, searched, and investigated. The surviving Cassidy sons were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murdering federal agents. Frank Cassidy died in federal custody 3 days later, officially of a heart attack, though his family suspected otherwise. But the government had won a Pyrrhic victory. The siege of Morgan's Creek became a rallying cry for property rights activists, constitutional conservatives, and rural Americans who felt abandoned by a federal system that valued environmental regulations over generational heritage. Thomas Cassidy became a martyr, his death symbolizing everything that had gone wrong when government authority replaced common sense and federal bureaucrats decided they knew better than families who'd worked the same land for 6 generations. The surviving mountain defenders scattered, some disappearing into the vast Appalachian wilderness, others surrendering to face federal prosecution. But the ideas they'd fought for, the principles Thomas Cassidy had died defending, those couldn't be arrested or prosecuted. They lived on in the hearts of rural Americans who understood that property rights meant more than government convenience, that family legacy mattered more than environmental studies conducted by people who'd never breathed mountain air. Morgan's Creek itself became a federal wilderness area, exactly as the environmental groups had planned. Today, government employees give tours to visitors, explaining how they saved the watershed from the ignorant mountain families who'd supposedly threatened its ecological integrity. They don't mention Thomas Cassidy or the 9 people who died defending the principle that a man's property is his castle. They don't talk about 6 generations of family history erased by court orders and federal bullets. The Cassidy homestead was bulldozed, the family cemetery relocated, the log house that had sheltered 6 generations reduced to rubble and hauled away. Nothing remains to mark where Thomas Cassidy made his final stand, except a small brass plaque placed by the Environmental Protection Agency, commemorating the preservation of critical watershed habitat for future generations. But if you know where to look, if you understand mountain ways, you can still find traces of what happened, bullet holes in trees that have grown over but not healed, foundations hidden by kudzu where outbuildings once stood, and sometimes, on September mornings when fog rolls down from the ridgelines, local people claim you can still hear the echo of gunfire, the ghost of a battle that proved some Americans would rather die standing than live kneeling. The siege of Morgan's Creek changed nothing and everything. Federal environmental seizures continue, rural families still lose their land to government bureaucrats, and Washington politicians still write laws affecting people they'll never meet in places they'll never visit. But somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, carved into stone and memory, the name Thomas Patrick Cassidy reminds anyone willing to listen that there are still Americans who believe some things are worth dying for. That's the most dangerous lesson government can never quite eliminate. The knowledge that ordinary people, pushed too far, can become something extraordinary, that mountain families, defending their own ground, can make even the federal government pay a price for their authority, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the courage of desperate men can echo through generations, inspiring others to ask themselves the same question Thomas Cassidy answered with his blood on a September morning in 1991. What matters more, safety or freedom, comfort or principle, government authority or family honor? The answer, written in the blood of 9 Americans in a forgotten hollow, depends on whether you're willing to die for what you believe.